Today we are very happy to have in our midst Professor Girón Negrón, Luis Girón Negrón from Harvard. He has spoken here, last was quite some years ago, I think, or 2 or 3 times. So some of you may have heard him. For those of you who are seeing him and hearing him for the first time, there's a little bit of an information about him. He is a secular Franciscan from Puerto Rico and William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard. He teaches and writes about Muslims, Christians, and Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, their literature and religious history in the Middle Ages through early modernity. Luis has traveled to numerous countries, including Peru, Spain, Italy, Egypt, Morocco, where he studied Arabic, Israel, where he studied Hebrew, India, Belarus, South Africa, and England. He knows at least 11 major languages since the last time I've noted it. In between, I've added some more to this, probably, as well as a number of their dialects and historical variants. He thus brings to us rich resources from linguistics, theology, mysticism, and his own spiritual studies and practices in his reflections on Easter. Friends, please welcome Professor Luis Girón.
Well, thank you again for your hospitality, Swami. It's wonderful to be back. It is always a pleasure to be here and to be able to celebrate Easter with you at the Vedanta Society. And it's been a while. I think it's been now 15, 18 years since the first time I came, also on Easter Sunday, which is somewhat poignant and challenging. I was looking over my notes from back then, and I remember my reflections at the time revolved around the spiritual meaning of Easter for Christians, taking at the time as my point of departure this gorgeous mystical hymn that was recited last night at the Easter Vigil, the Exalted. I think I was also able here to celebrate the memory of a Puerto Rican saint who spoke with deep spiritual wisdom about the Easter Vigil. Vivimos para esta noche. We live for this night. Now, to talk about the spirituality of Easter meant and still means coming to grips with how Christians try to make their own the events that are proclaimed in today's feast, the Feast of Feasts across the Christian world. Christians from all traditions, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestants alike, and this year in particular, when Easter falls on the same Sunday across most of these traditions, Christians from all stripes rejoice today in the resurrection of Christ, in the exultant profession that Christ, God incarnate, had been tortured and crucified, and innocent put to death, then rose from the dead, and with his rising proclaimed that death did not have the final word on who we are, that the bondage of suffering, of sorrow could be broken, that God's grace, the wells of eternal life flowed freely, unrestrained, reuniting a wandering, relieved humanity with a loving and living God. These are all themes woven into homilies across the Christian world today. And also many preachers would highlight that Easter is not a mere historic memorial. It is not simply an anniversary, as if to say there was a great man who died 2,000 years ago, then came back, so we gather every year simply to mark the anniversary of a significant event that happened a long time ago. Easter is not only about marking an important event in the ancient past, it is rather about what the ancient Greeks used to call anamnesis, recollection. It is to relive that first Easter, not simply as a memento, not simply as a souvenir or a reminder of the past, but as a key in understanding that opens up both the present and the future. Easter for the Christian world has been a radical call to participate fully in the transformative experience of the risen Christ, and to do so in our own lives, day in and day out. to experience the risen Christ not as a past event, but as the very core of who we are, our spiritual self in God. There are many ways in which Christians try to do this, ways in which we try to connect the death and resurrection of Christ with our present experience. In recent days, for example, with all the immigrants and foreigners among us who have been unjustly mistreated, sequestered, in prison without being charged for a crime, victims of cruelty, vindictiveness, xenophobic bigotry, a few fellow Christians have upheld these sisters and brothers in the past few days as painful mirrors of Jesus' passion, modern reflections of the suffering Christ, unjustly imprisoned, tortured, sentenced to death, while also embracing the hope of the resurrection, that the power of the risen Christ might prevail once again in our time against the powers of evil. I'm always touched to remember that in some communities, the patron of prisoners in death row is no other than Jesus himself. But we can also connect the remembrance of that first Easter to the mystical core of Jesus' resurrection, that which we are called to realize in our own lives. As Swami Tyagananda said so beautifully in an Easter meditation in 2020, I think in the midst of COVID, when Jesus says to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life," Swami pointed out, he was inviting us not to confuse our limited selves, our paltry egos bound to a mortal body and a voluble mind, body, mind, intellect, and ego, not to confuse them with the true divine I that speaks to us in this quotation from the Gospel of St. John. The divine I of Jesus that spoke those words to Martha when she was grieving over the death of her brother Lazarus invites us again and again to die to ourselves, to crucify our egos, in order that we might also rise with him, resurrected in the Spirit, and rediscover that he was already there waiting for us behind the curtain of our illusions. Easter is indeed not simply about commemorating the historical Jesus that we rightly admire, but to embrace the timeless Jesus that saves, the risen Christ that opens a path to freedom, transcendence, eternal happiness rooted in the divine self. As the ancient exalted proclaim, as I heard it last night, "O truly blessed night, when things of heaven are wed to those of earth, and the divine to the human." What I want to do then in the time that remains is to share some more reflections on this mystical understanding of today's feast by doing something that I love dearly, looking at a few verses from one of our greatest Christian mystics that give poetic voice to the spiritual center of Easter in the form of a love story. The mystic is my beloved John of the Cross, a 16th century Spanish saint. Saint John devoted his life to contemplative prayer, priestly ministry, and the formation of novices in his religious order, recruited to do so by another great saint and fellow mystic, Saint Teresa of Avila. He was also a Spanish poet, a literary giant from a classical period in the history of Spanish literature. He was a contemporary of Cervantes. His sacred poems were masterpieces of Golden Age Spanish literature. But he did not write them simply for self-expression or to seek literary fame. They were meant to serve a loftier purpose as teaching vehicles for spiritual instruction. He wrote many of them in order to teach the young novices under his care about contemplative prayer and spiritual life. Indeed, his major treatises on mystical theology were all written in the form of commentaries on his own poems. He would write these gorgeous poems, bring the novices out for picnics around the convent, read them, pray with them, and then he would use the verses to convey to them some of the basic themes in the religious life they have embraced as part of the Carmelite reform. The excerpts that I chose are two stanzas from St. John of the Cross Cántico Espiritual, the spiritual canticle. He wrote the bulk of this poem during almost 9 months of grievous mistreatment and isolation while imprisoned in Toledo. And he finished it years later in Granada, in southern Spain, while in charge of the religious formation of the young novices. It was conceived from the beginning as a poetic paraphrase of the biblical Song of Songs, one of the wisdom books of the Bible. The Song of Songs was what is called an ancient epithalamium, a New Eastern love poem, which Christians and Jews interpreted as a mystical allegory of God's love for us, described with nuptial imagery of human intimacy and affection. It was a poem about the marriage of a king and a Sulamite woman in the ancient Near East. And Christians and Jews through time would look at this book and says, it's not just a love poem or a celebration of a wedding. It talks about our own relationship with God. It uses the language of marriage, the language of affection to convey something intimate about how God relates to us. For John in particular, the Song of Songs conveyed in poetic language the soul's efforts to unite with Christ as lover and beloved do, the attainment of mystical union. So he rewrote the Song of Songs in his own poem in order to retell the Easter story as a love story. The story of the soul that risen from the morass of false delusions and spiritual darkness seeks out her divine beloved in order to rediscover her true self through their intimate bond in the fruition of love. He rewrote the Song of Songs because he expected the novices to know that book of the Bible inside out. They had learned Spanish poetry, they had learned about the Bible, and so he wrote it well aware of what they knew and how to shock them into a realization of spiritual meaning through the verses that he put together. So let me read the first one. You have 4 stanzas in the handout. I'm just going to comment the first 2 and then end with the last one. Says, ¿A dónde te escondiste, amado, y me dejaste con gemido? Como el ciervo huiste, habiéndome herido. Salí tras ti clamando, y eras ido. Where did you hide, my beloved, and left me moaning? You fled like the stag, leaving me wounded. I went out after you clamoring, and you were gone. John's spiritual canticle begins in the middle of the story, in medias res. It begins with this anguished cry of an aching lover. ¿A dónde te escondiste, amado? Where did you hide and left me moaning? This is an abrupt beginning. The poem begins without preambles, with a cry of pain, bemoaning a hidden love. The absence of him apostrophized at the beginning of the next verse, as if an enchantment could reenact his absence. The poem begins like Christians in the Easter Vigil last night. It begins in a dark night after Christ's crucifixion, waiting in anguish, hoping for a sign that he's not simply gone, as Julian of Norwich would say, that all things shall be well and all manners of things shall be well. What do we know about this aching lover at the beginning of the poem? Well, for Christian readers who knew the Song of Songs, the love-struck speaker was the bride. It's the bride that is speaking from the depths of her desire. It's the voice of the poem. However, unlike the bride in the Bible, whose physical beauty is graphically evoked with stunning imagery, there are these gorgeous evocations of the Sulamite throughout the Song of Songs. Unlike her in the Bible, the bride in St. John's poem appears only as a voice, as a disembodied voice, this elusive, incorporeal presence devoid of any physical traits. Indeed, aside from the rubrics that label her the sposa in the manuscripts, Gender markers as female only appear within the text after her first encounter with the beloved, almost midway through the poem. Her body is never described anywhere, for it is the soul itself that speaks from the depth of her longing. Not the physical woman, but the soul itself longing for God. These opening verses set up the anticipation of a sacred dialogue. An eye that seeks a thou, awaiting for a response, in restless search for her absent groom. Absent and unnamed. For Christian mystics, as I said, read the Song of Songs as the love story of Christ the Beloved and his earthly lover, our own soul. St. John himself spells out the explicit identity of the Beloved in his commentary on this verse. And he says, this is telling him, the novice, what he's trying to say through the poem. No? In this first stanza, the soul, enamored of the Word, her bridegroom, the Son of God, longs for union with him through clear and essential vision. She records her longings of love and complains to him of his absence, especially since his love wounds her. Through this love, she went out from all creatures and from herself, and yet she must suffer the beloved's absence, for she is not freed from mortal flesh as the enjoyment of him in the glory of eternity requires. Accordingly, she says, "Where have you hidden? ¿Adónde te escondiste?" God, however, is not even mentioned in the Song of Songs. It's one of the few books in the Bible where there is no reference to God whatsoever, nor is Christ named explicitly in St. John's poem. The poem only tells a love story. We are invited to recognize God in the anonymous beloved, and only then we can recognize ourselves in the wandering lover looking for him. Only then we can allow ourselves to be drawn by her words, that we might partake of her in her anguish, in her pain, in her desperate search for him, whose absence fills her desire for the comforting solace of his presence. We might not visualize ourselves as the biblical Sulamite of exotic beauty, but we can hear the voice of our restless hearts in John's haunting evocation of her longings. So neither lover nor beloved are described, but she's heard. When her beloved went into hiding, he left her moaning. Me dejaste con gemido. You left me moaning. Now this is a visceral, wordless groan completely foreign to his literary models in Spanish and Italian love poetry. He expected the novices to know all the great love poems of this rich moment in Spanish history. And he was expecting to know them and see what was strange about the story he was telling. Her groans give way to the words of her complaint. Como el ciervo huiste habiéndome herido, salí tras ti clamando y era sido. You fled like the stag, leaving me wounded. I went after you clamoring, and you were gone. And something strange happens here. This is always wonderful when I'm teaching this in the classroom, because it's the moment where students try to understand what St. John is doing. Her beloved fled like a deer, leaving her wounded. Now, this image of the deer, the gazelle, the stag, is conspicuous in the Song of Songs, as John himself told us. It appears everywhere in the Bible, in the Psalms, and in the Christian tradition at large. Moreover, this idea of the fleeing stag wounded by a hunter was a popular image, both in Italian and in Spanish love poetry, no? And in their Latin sources. The poetic traditions that would be all too familiar to contemporary readers, his Carmelite novices included. So many people in love, in all this poetry, people in love were always compared to deers wounded by the arrows of hunters. There are hundreds and hundreds of deers fleeing away from hunters who throw arrows at them like Cupid. And yet, an attentive reader would have been unsettled, disturbed by something odd that happens in the poem. there is an inversion of sorts in St. John's recourse to an otherwise familiar image. In the local traditions of love poetry, the fleeing stags are wounded by their hunters. You usually have the hunter goes after the stag, throws the arrow, and the deer is wounded. But here something happens. Here the lover is a female hunter. She's searching for the fugitive deer. The deer escapes, but the hunter herself is wounded. The stag lives unscathed, whereas the hunter is the one wounded by the flight of the beloved. It's something strange, something unexpected that should have caught the attention of the novices. This enigmatic moment opens a poetic arc that will gain its full meaning when we reach the other stanza. This is the first time that John draws inspiration from his precise understanding of what his readers knew and used that for a mystical pedagogy. He expected the young novices to be perplexed, to be befuddled by this inversion of a familiar image, the sense of a strangeness that it evokes, and thus be drawn into a process of contemplative discernment about its meaning. There was a Russian scholar who talks about defamiliarization, that when people are used to something, it takes a lot of effort to rediscover it as if it were new. This is one of the challenges for Christian preachers talking about Easter. No, it's the same story. The story doesn't change year after year, and yet you have to find different ways of connecting to the congregation and sharing what Easter is about. And yet, how to avoid being repetitive, how to convey to people the newness, the strangeness of this event. Defamiliarization or stressing. Now, just as the divine beloved left discernible traces of his passing for the wandering lover to find, so the poet also leaves behind cues for us to decipher, that we might better accompany this restless figure into an unmediated encounter. And one more thing happens here. The lover, St. John says, went out, sali, calling for him, but he was gone. This is in line with a couple of verses in the Song of Songs where the bride first fails at night to find her beloved in bed, perhaps while in a dream, and then she roams all over town searching for him, but he's nowhere to be found. She's frantically looking for this elusive God that seems to be hiding somewhere. Going out, salir, is a trope in Christian mystical literature for entering within, searching for the God who dwells, to echo Teresa of Avila, in the inner castle of the soul. That is, the divine eye of the risen Jesus that dwells within us. As St. Augustine once said, a very famous line that many of these mystics loved dearly and understood as speaking about their own experience, noli foras ire in terreps ipsum redi, in interiore homine habitat veritas. Do not go out, go back into yourself. Truth dwells inside the person. The real scope of her journey is hinted at in these verses, plunging into an inward search for ecstatic union with the absent beloved hidden within her. The rhyming scheme reinforces this sequence of events with expressive economy. Gemido, her cry of pain. Herido, wounded by the groom. Ido, who has gone missing. The absence of God is a wound that drives us out of ourselves and back inside in search of the risen Christ alive within us. This is the beginning of a long poem. It has 40 stanzas. I am not going to go over all 40 stanzas, usually with the students, but I'm going to jump here to the 7th stanza of the poem, which is at a central moment in John's reflection. Apártalos, amado, que voy de vuelo. Vuélvete, paloma, que el ciervo vulnerado por el otero asoma, al aire de tu vuelo y fresco toma. Cast them away, beloved, I'm taking flight. Turn, my dove, for the wounded stag makes an appearance on the hill, cooled by the breeze of your flight. Between the first stanza and the one before us, the canticle has told part of the story of the love-struck bride and her desperate search for an absent groom, an unmediated encounter with Jesus the Beloved. Her various inquiries about his whereabouts has come to nothing so far in the poem. She goes around, she runs into shepherds, she asks them if they had seen him, but there has no reply. She goes through the forest, then she finally talks to nature, and she tells nature, have you seen my beloved? And nature speaks back to her, he left his grace here when he was flying by. But she's so anguished that she continues running and she doesn't find her anywhere. She doesn't want mediators, she doesn't want go-betweens, anyone to come between her and the beloved. The intervening stanzas focus on her anguishing response to the hidden God veiled in darkness. However, at a pivotal moment in the previous stanza, in the stranglehold of despair, the lover finally wishes that the fountain she suddenly stumbled upon were to reflect the eyes of the beloved, which were already drawn and imprinted within her. And it is at this juncture that she cries out, Apártalos, amado, que voy de vuelo. Cast them away, beloved. I'm taking flight. This is the final moment when she can no longer wait. She wants to ascend and encounter him. And here we once again are plunged into John's unexpected twist of the biblical source at hand. In the Song of Songs, these words, apártalos, are the words of the groom. The love-struck groom, overwhelmed by the beauty of his lover's eyes, asks her to cast her glance away from him because he's overwhelmed. Her eyes are driving him wild. But here, an attentive reader of the Bible would realize that in the Spanish canticle, the female lover is the one speaking the words that Scripture assigns to the groom. In the Bible, he speaks. In St. John's poem, she's the one who says this. The lover is the one who is asking her beloved to withdraw his eyes from her and look away. And this is no mistake. John knew his Bible very well. This confusion is meant to anticipate one of the contemplative experiences that is given lyrical expression from this point onward, the ecstatic moment of transformative union between God and the soul that blurs the rigid boundaries between the human self and the divine other in the intimate fruition of their love. In his commentary, John intimates that this flight is a static rapture, like the ones that Teresa of Avila herself have written about. Elsewhere in his poetry, their mutual transformation is also given concise expression. The dark night of the last night vigil, where the lovers are brought together, amado con amada, en el amado transformada. O night that has united the lover with his beloved, transforming the beloved in her lover. And he further expounds on this unitive experience of quasi-deification in another comment on his poems. And St. John says, let me read, a soul makes room for God. When this is done, the soul will be looming by and transforming God. And God will so communicate his supernatural being to the soul that it will appear to be God himself and will possess what God himself possesses. When God grants this supernatural favor to the soul, so great union is caused that all things of both God and the soul become one in participant transformation, and the soul appears to be God more than a soul. Indeed, it is God by participation. Yet truly, its being, even though transformed, is naturally as distinct from God as it was before. So here, in the spiritual canticle, in deliberate anticipation of the lovers' union, John once again guides his readers with a subversion of what they might know, that they may come to realize how, when God and his devotee come together in love, a profound transformation ensues, as if their identities were interchangeable. This was a trope in secular love poetry, but here it becomes the aspirational goal of a devout Christian seeker in the eternal Easter. It is at this crucial moment that the lover also hears for the first time the voice of her elusive groom, "Turn, my dove, for the wounded stag makes an appearance on the hill, cooled by the breeze of your flight." Now, when does this happen? When does she's been looking for him. She's spent 8, 9 stanzas. He's nowhere to be found. And when she's about to run, desperately looking for him, all of a sudden he speaks. It's the first time that God speaks in the poem. And where does it happen? Well, just as the lover is about to take flight, the voice of the beloved erupts in the very middle of the verse. Now, if I were doing this with students of literature, they will know that there is one verse, 11 syllable verse, hendecasyllable, and usually people alternate. But here, in the middle of the verse, when she's about to fly, he just shows up, breaks the verse asunder. His voice breaks asunder a hendecasyllable, splitting it in 2 parts, one spoken by the lover, the other by the beloved. Que voy de vuelo, I'm taking flight. Vuélvete paloma, turn my dove. Love and beloved are indeed united in a single verse that embraces their first exchange, an adumbration of their impending union at the center of the poem a few stanzas later. You have to realize he really knew. He handled with perfection every convention of a Spanish classical poetry, and he knows how to use his expressive potential, his versification, to communicate to his readers, to his listeners, the spiritual interpretation of the Bible that was at the heart of this project. What does he say to her? What are the words of the beloved to the bride? The bridegroom first addresses her as her dove, Paloma, echoing the Song of Songs 4:1. Einayi yonin mi ba'at lesamatek, your dove eyes behind your hair locks. Immediately following, his words in verse 3 now reconnect with the very first stanza that I read for you. If you remember at the very beginning, como el siervo oíste habiéndome herido, no? You left me like the stag, you fled like the stag, leaving me wounded. At the beginning, the lover described him as a stag that fled away, leaving her wounded. But now he's the one comparing himself to a wounded stag. Now he is el siervo vulnerado. Now he's the one who goes up the hill and seeks healing solace in the soft breeze found by her flight. So Christ is now the one wounded by his love for his loving devotee. At the beginning, she was wounded. Now he's also wounded out of love for her. As John explains it in his own comment on this for the novices, the bridegroom now acts similarly. Beholding that the bride is wounded with love for him because of her moan, he is also wounded with love for her. Among lovers, the wound of one is a wound for both, and the two have but one feeling. As with an appropriation of his words in Song of Songs 6, lover and beloved are on the threshold of becoming indistinguishable in their love. He is both the fleeing stag that wounded his frantic seeker with his absence, and also the wounded stag who now seeks solace and refreshment in the love-driven flight of his pursuer. Or to go back to Swami's meditation, this is an Easter moment when the seeker sets aside her false self, that limited sense of self entwined with her body and her mind, and discovers her truest self in the divine eye, the moment when the lover and the beloved find themselves in each other. And what did the beloved ask of his lover upon appearing? Vuélvete. the imperative form of volver that reverberates in both her words and is reinforced by alliteration. Voy de vuelo, vuélvete, vulnerado. There are various moments in the Song of Songs that where the beloved's command are echoed. In Song of Songs 7:1, the beloved tells her, Shubi Shubi Hashulamit, Shubi Shubi Benehesevach, turn back, O maid of Shulem, turn back, that we may gaze upon you. And later the bride also tells that her beloved said, Kumi lach rayati yafati ulehileha, arise, my darling, my fair one, come away. The meaning of Shuvi in the biblical song has attracted the attention of Jewish and Christian interpreters, especially in connection to the ideal of a spiritual conversion, teshubah. It suffices just to say that the Spanish vuélvete invites at least three translations in English. Vuélvete could mean go back, it could mean come to me, or it could mean turn yourself into something. It is almost as if she were told to go away and come back to him at the same time, and in the process to turn herself into something. This ambiguity, which seems to echo the opposite commands in the Bible, anchors this liminal situation of the bride and her first encounter with the groom. Vuélvete is also a call to conversion, to move beyond its penitential significance to another adumbration of the mutual transformation of God and seeker in the throes of ecstatic union. An intimation that also a friend of mine connected to the Sufis. Lakat sarakal bikavilan kula suratin. My heart can take on any form. In the immersive search for God, the beloved, within ourselves, we are caught like the lover in the impossible bind to both go back into the darkness of his self-concealment and forward towards him who awaits for us with open arms. Her ecstatic response to his appearance, the consummation of their union, the inebriation of love, and the lover's zigzagging drama amidst his unexpected arrivals and departures, all of this will unfold throughout the poem as John guides his young students and us with them into the heart of this sacred love story. Now, I have indulged in reading these verses with you not only because I love his poetry and because I always find strength and inspiration in his spiritual wisdom, but also because over the years I have come to realize that in almost every mystic that I teach, I find a reminder of Easter as a lived experience, the ascent of the Spirit, the resurrection into the Spirit as a mystical encounter with the living God. 18 years ago, I spoke to the Carmelite friars in Úbeda at the convent where St. John passed away on the feast of his passing, December 16. The night before the lecture, we went to pray at the chapel built around the site of his passing, and around midnight, we did as John did on his deathbed when he was about to go back to his Father. John asked one of the friars to read out for him from the biblical Song of Songs, and we did the same that night. One of the friars read excerpts of the ancient love song, as John himself had done many times with his novices when he took them out to the fields around the convent to pray and sing by the running waters of the Darro River. And then, after a moment of silence when the bell struck midnight, we listened with reverence to John's poetic version of this sacred love story recited by one of the friars. It was a beautiful moment of prayer. So I will simply end here by reading the lover's exultant response when she comes face to face with the living God, the ecstatic preamble to the Easter mysteries of her own ascent into God's bosom, and perhaps the most famous verses of St. John. Mi amado, las montañas, los valles solitarios nemorosos, las ínsulas extrañas, los ríos sonorosos, el silbo de los aires amorosos, la noche sosegada en par de los levantes de la aurora, la música callada, la soledad sonora, la cena que recrea y enamora. My beloved, the mountains, the lonely sylvan valleys, the strange islands, the sounding rivers, the whistling of the enamored winds, the night as calm as the east winds of dawn, the silent music, the sounding solitude, the supper that refreshes and ignites love. Happy Easter, everyone.